Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Sloan, Program Manager for Transportation Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar on the states to watch in 2014 on transportation funding. You know, last year was a very busy year in transportation funding, and there remains an intense level of interest in these issues around the country. When I last checked, we had folks from more than half the states and the District of Columbia signed up for this webinar. So welcome, everybody. I've assembled a group of folks who perhaps know best what's happening and what could happen in state capitals this year on the transportation revenue front, because many of them are reporters who roam the halls of the nation's state houses and capitol buildings on a regular basis. A bit about the agenda for the webinar today. Over the course of the next hour, we're going to first take a look back at the busy 2013. Then I'll call on 8 of the nation's best state house political or transportation beat reporters to provide updates on states that are expected to see activity this year. In addition, I'll have updates on 10 other states worth noting. CSG is a national organization, but one of our greatest strengths is our regional focus. And so I've divided up the states according to the CSG regions for the purposes of our discussion today. We'll start in the West, followed by the Midwest, East, and South. At the end of the hour, we'll respond to your questions and comments. If you have something to tell us or something you'd like to ask, you can enter it using the GoToWebinar interface. We'll collate those, and I'll read as many as time allows and direct them to one of our guests. So first, a look back at 2013, and here to provide a national perspective on that is Dan Bach, who is a staff writer for Statewide, which, for those who don't know, is a news service of the Pew Charitable Trusts and a great source of news on all things state government related. Dan is based in Washington, D.C. And Dan, I think as we look back at 2013, one of the things that was significant was the sheer amount of activity in states on transportation funding after what was really several years of near inactivity. I know that Transportation for America and others have said as many as 20 or more states at least considered ways to increase transportation funding. What do you think were the factors behind all that activity?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors that you have to consider is that a lot of governors made it a priority. So if you look at Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, Wyoming, Pennsylvania, the governors really kind of put that out as one of their top agenda items. And it was in a year where elections weren't imminent. In a lot of state houses, that means that there's more time to look at it. That wasn't obviously the case in Virginia, but the governor wasn't up for election. So I think it starts there, and you know, because there's 2 different things that have to come together. There's need and there's will, and you know, there's lots of need, and there's I'm sure we're going to talk about things, you know, about the federal gas tax, the uncertainty over that, whether or not that's going to continue. Just the most of these are excise taxes that don't increase if gasoline becomes more expensive. It's still a flat amount per gallon, and in many states this is, it's been 10, 20 years since these have been enacted, so they're not really keeping up with inflation or with the cost of building roads or keeping them up. So there's a lot of needs that are going there, but there's also political will. And so I think one thing that really struck me looking over some of those states is the political will. And a lot of these places, just people have been talking about this for years and years, and there wasn't really much discussion about the need because everybody knew there was a need. There wasn't, the options were pretty well explored because they've been explored time and time again. So it just came down to political will and, you know, who is going to, I guess, you know, keep riding on legislators until they come up with something. And sometimes those packages look nothing like what the governors actually proposed, but they did get a package through.
So I wanted to put up this map, which is from the aforementioned Transportation for America, and you mentioned the states that sort of enacted the major transportation packages in 2013, and those were 6 states: Maryland, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Virginia, and Wyoming. And there are 3 other states in the dark red that you see on this map whose funding efforts were somewhat more limited in scope. I know that Nevada, for instance, allowed Clark County, where Las Vegas is, to index its gas tax. And Ohio, of course, did that bonding on turnpike revenues. And Arkansas had a constitutional amendment that passed actually in 2012 that allowed them to increase the sales tax and do some bonding to fund projects and so forth. But Dan, as you look at what the 6 states that did the major funding overhauls, what stands out with regards to the different strategies that they employed, and do you think what they did is going to have an influence in other states in 2014 and beyond?
Well, I think there's a number of strategies that came out of that, and I mean it's important to remember that a lot of these, where the products are just intense negotiations where things, the mix was pretty varied. So there's not necessarily a blueprint for any state. But that said, one of the most striking things I thought was the effort in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to get away from, I guess, retail sales taxes and put it more as a wholesale gas tax on. And I don't know if politically it just sounded better or made it more palatable to legislators that they weren't raising the tax X cents per gallon. Everybody knows that the taxes in the wholesale will trickle down to motorists, but I think that was an interesting wrinkle that I hadn't really foreseen, and it, like I said, it happened in those 3 states. I would say that the other things that that there were a number of other tactics we've seen before. Some states did raise the gas tax straight up, Vermont and Wyoming, and then there were some ties to internet sales tax, national legislation in Maryland and Virginia. It wasn't a major component of those, but it was interesting that they said, when Congress enacts this legislation that would let, online transactions be taxed just like in-person ones for sales tax, then we're going to take a share of that money and put it towards transportation. And so far, the piece of legislation, the Marketplace Fairness Act, hasn't actually passed. It's passed the Senate, but not the House of Representatives. But it was kind of banking on something that is not a certainty. And then finally, I'd just say that the really striking thing is that out of all of that is just, like I said, determination and will, and a whole bunch of factors that played into this. In Virginia, you might recall, there was actually sort of a tacit agreement that in exchange for this passing, the Senate Democrats were going to get Medicaid expansion. And so, when you put all things on the table, then maybe more possibilities are out there than it seemed like at first.
Yeah. So as we turn now to 2014 and the states to watch, and this is a list of some of the states we'll cover over the next hour, do you expect the level of state activity that we saw in 2013 to continue, or will other factors like the different political considerations this year and the uncertainty about the federal transportation program, do you expect those to sort of dampen some of the enthusiasm?
I think there'll be a lot of enthusiasm. I'm not entirely sure that as many bills will reach the governor's desk or be enacted into law. And again, that gets back to one thing we've seen is not as many governors have been out in front of this. This year you've seen governors, which we'll get into, I'm sure, in Delaware and Washington, really kind of ride this. But, just there's not that crucial leadership in a lot of these state houses. And 36 governors seats will be determined this year, so that a lot of people have, a lot of leaders have other things on their mind, mainly re-election. Legislators the same way. I believe there's 46 states that are holding legislative elections this year. So there's a lot going on that might take legislators' attention away from this issue. That also means that legislative sessions tend to be shorter in these years, and so there's less time just to kind of let all that come through. You did mention the federal uncertainty. You know, I think legislators are aware of that. I'm not sure that they're as aware of you know, how imminent this could be as far as the shortfalls in federal transportation funding. I think Sean, you've written about how, you know, we could see some slowing down of payments starting this summer. Certainly, the Highway Trust Fund is projected to run out of money by 2015 or in 2015, and that, you know, while it causes uncertainty, I think, you know, that can go both ways. But I think mainly it's limited time and limited attention this year, and limited leadership so far by the governors. Of course, that could change.
Well, thanks, Dan, and please stay with us, and I'd like to get your thoughts at the end of the hour about what you hear from some folks here. We're going to hear now about sort of what's going on in a number of states this year that seem poised to tackle transportation revenues in some way. And we want to go out west first. Washington State, as Dan mentioned, was certainly in the transportation funding conversation in 2013, and at various times over the course of the year appeared to be on the verge of producing a revenue package, but the legislature was never quite able to get anything across the finish line. We want to find out if the chances are likely to be any better in 2014, and for that, let's turn to Jordan Schrader. He's a state capitol reporter for the News Tribune in Tacoma, Washington. Jordan, what do you expect to happen in Olympia this year on the transportation front?
Prospects for a transportation package seem to be looking dimmer and dimmer all the time, actually. Just kind of a quick note on Washington's politics. We have a new Democratic governor, one in a long line of Democrats controlling the governor's mansion. We have Democrats controlling our state house, but we have a new dynamic in the state Senate where Republicans have essentially taken over with the help of two Democrats who defected. They're still Democrats, but they're part of a majority coalition that's mostly Republican. And the governor's made transportation a big priority in passing a package. And transportation tends to be a pretty bipartisan topic around here. For one thing, you need supermajorities to pass bonds. So there were big gas tax increases in 2003 and 2005, and both of those had a bipartisan tinge to them. Now we're sort of on the downward slope from those projects. They're finishing up, most of them, and gas taxes, like other parts of the country, is stagnant and about to start falling. And there's been trouble funding mass transit, partly because there was a charge on vehicles that was repealed more than a decade ago, and they're still trying to really figure out how to fund some of these things without that. There's been a task force that was assigned to look at the need, and they came up with $50 billion as, I think, the 10-year need. But even if you look at a much more modest, just sort of what's necessary with preservation and maintenance, it's much smaller, more like $3 billion. And there's a coalition of business, labor, environmentalists, local governments, and others who've all kind of come together and tried to lobby for a transportation package. The ports are heavily involved. They're talking. We have ports of Tacoma and Seattle and others that are talking about how they're getting increased competition with British Columbia and with the potential widening of the Panama Canal, and they need better routes for Washington State exports to get to market. So last year there was a couple of different versions of a package proposed, basically hovering somewhere around 10, 11, 12 cents of a per gallon gas tax increase. They'd fund maintenance preservation, but also a bunch of new projects, including some of those that the ports want, including finishing our floating bridge across Lake Washington, and some others. And the Republicans and the Democrats basically agree on a package roughly that size. The Democratic Governor Inslee would sign it, but There's a lot of sticking points, and it's after a year of listening sessions with the public and negotiating sessions, things just seem to be stuck. Some of the sticking points include that the Senate's Republican majority wants a series of what they call reforms to how money gets spent by our Department of Transportation, and at the top of their list is actually not related to DOT spending. They want the sales tax that gets charged to the state on its highway construction projects to get funneled back into highways instead of going, as it does right now, to our general fund that covers education and social services and things like that. That's sort of at the top of their list, but they have a whole long list of reforms that they want, and the Democrats have balked at a lot of that. The Democrats want more spending on mass transit, and the Republicans have not really agreed to go very far on that, although they have gone along with the idea of giving local governments some local options for raising money for transit. So that's been another sticking point. But really, things looked potentially a little brighter late last year. There was a special session to give Boeing some tax breaks when they were threatening to potentially move to another state to do their build their 777X in another state. But that didn't happen, and Boeing got the tax breaks and has now, along with a new labor contract, has agreed to build the plane here. So that lever has kind of been removed, and things on transportation just kind of seem to be stuck. It could fire up again. We're in the middle of a 60-day legislative session that's about, I think, 18, 19 days in now. And so we'll know in the next month and a half exactly what to expect. But people seem to be pretty pessimistic around here. And there's a couple of recent complications. The governor has signed on to a multi-state climate change initiative with other West Coast governors. He pledged a few things. None of it is binding, but he did pledge the state to adopt what's called a low-carbon fuel standard. That requires biofuel or other alternatives to gasoline. And some Republicans are insisting that would really jack up the price of gas. Others say no, it wouldn't. But there's a disagreement on that. That may be used as what I think Democrats would say is an excuse to scuttle the package. But at any rate, it definitely is becoming a point of contention. And then the latest thing we've heard is that King County, which is the county that Seattle is in, it's the most populous county in the state, is considering going it alone. They're tired of waiting, at least their county executive is, and he's proposing a ballot measure for the April ballot that would raise some fees and taxes. And there's some thought that if King County were to approve that, which seems kind of doubtful because voters up there have rejected some similar things in the past, but if they were to approve that, that could make it tougher to get a statewide ballot measure through. And there's no guarantee that voters would get to weigh in on the statewide package, but it's at least a possibility because it's not too hard to get things onto into the initiative process here. So that's another possibility. A lot of the votes for any kind of a statewide package would have to come from King County, the sort of liberal bastion of the state, and there would be some worry that among supporters that if they just voted for their own local bailout package, they're not going to do it for the state. So prospects kind of looking dim at this point, but it could easily turn around in the next 45 days or so.
Yeah. Well, Jordan, thank you, and we will definitely keep an eye on Washington as things go along here, and please stay with us if you can, and we may have questions for you at the end. Folks, those of you who are on the line with us, we've got everybody muted, all the speakers, but we're still getting a little bit of noise on the line here, and hopefully folks aren't having too much trouble hearing us. But if you can, maybe mute your phone from your end as well when you're not speaking, and that way we can cut down on some of the noise. So we're going to head a little ways east from where Jordan is now and take a look at what's happening in Idaho this year. And for that, we turn to Dan Popke, who is a a political reporter for the Idaho Statesman in Boise. Dan, I know transportation funding has been on the agenda for what seems like many years in Idaho. Is something going to happen this year, or is Governor Otter's re-election bid likely to throw a wrench into those plans?
Yeah, the wrench has already been applied, and it's moved it to off. We're not as complicated as our neighbor Washington. We don't have divided government. The legislature's been in Republican hands since 1961, and the governor's office has belonged to Republicans since 1995. And 1995 was the last time we raised revenue for transportation, and it took a flood and a presidential visit to convince the legislature to raise the gas tax by 4 cents a gallon. But this governor, Butch Otter, is very conservative, kind of a cowboy governor who talks about the proper role of government. And transportation, in his eyes, is one of those things government should do and needs to do. And he's been trying since he took office in 2007 to raise revenue. But he tried, he began the work his first year. There were bills introduced his second year in 08. In 09, he suffered a series of embarrassing defeats in the House of Representatives where bill after bill after bill was defeated, wide margins, and just couldn't put a coalition together, couldn't get the 20% of the legislature that's Democratic to help because he wasn't offering them enough and so forth. Just an odd footnote, some of the listeners may be familiar with the Meet the Press's favorite Tea Party Republican, Raul Labrador. He launched his career, became far better known because of his opposition to the governor's fuel tax and registration fee increases in 2009, and a year later got elected to Congress. After those defeats in 2010, as he was seeking his second term, the governor appointed a task force, and that task force reported after his reelection, and that was not coincidental, and said we needed roughly $500 million. We were behind $500 million a year, which in this state of 1.5 million, 1.6 million people is a fairly big number. But even his committee couldn't get the consensus to vote on what items to recommend to the legislature for revenue. They just, even that wasn't palatable. But once the economy started turning around last year, the Associated General Contractors, which represents the big construction guys, along with local governments and highway districts and labor and so forth, they revived a transportation coalition, started doing meetings, appearing at service clubs, trying to build some ground support for this. And they hoped that 2014 was going to be the year. But in October, the governor got a Tea Party challenger, the number 4 leader in the Senate, a guy named Russ Fulcher, and that was the end of it, basically. A couple of months later, in December, sort of in the run-up to the session, the governor gave a speech at the general contractors meeting, their winter meeting, and he was asked what the top priority for Idaho was in 2014, and his answer was getting me reelected. He announced then that the University of Idaho would conduct a poll on transportation funding in an effort to gauge what people really want and to try, ultimately, I think, to sell the idea. They're in the field now. The poll's funded partially by the university, and actually more of the money is coming from the contractors and other organizations that support raising more money for transportation. They're expected to make kind of a preliminary report before the legislature goes home to the joint meeting of the transportation committees in mid-March. One last thing, local option taxation authority exists in Idaho only for resort cities, so think Sun Valley. And then there's they can collect sales tax upon the approval of voters. The effort to broaden local option sales tax for transportation and other things has about a 40-year fight. There may be some movement on this. There's one of the Senate leaders, and who's a former Transportation Board chairman, is got a bill that would allow, upon the vote of the people, a collection of a local option tax to be as a sort of piggy bank, but no bonding authority. And that's in the past, it's always been about bonding authority. This would only be collect the money and spend it when you have it, and when you have a second vote of the people on what to spend it for. That's
okay.
about all I got.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, for that report from Idaho. Please stay with us on the line as well, and maybe folks will have some questions for you. I want to run down a few other states to watch out west this year. California could consider a ballot measure in November to generate an estimated $3 billion a year for road improvements by more than doubling vehicle license fees. In Colorado, there's a coalition supporting a statewide sales tax that would raise $600 million a year for road repair and construction and transit projects around the state. 2/3 of that would go to the Highway Users Tax Fund, and 1/3 would go to transit projects. Utah has identified an $11 billion shortfall in its long-range transportation plan. Among the revenue-generating ideas under consideration there, allowing counties to impose their own gas taxes, a statewide increase in taxes on all fuels, including compressed natural gas, a standard sales tax on gasoline, increased fares for public transportation, and applying an indexing mechanism to the state's fuel tax. Also, a transit tax for dirty air. This is interesting. There's a bill circulating that would let voters decide to raise sales taxes for expanded mass transit during times of bad air pollution. The latest gas tax increase proposal there would raise gasoline taxes statewide by 1.5 cents a year for 5 years and split the revenue between state and local governments unless the local option tax also passes, in which case all the increase would go to the state. Conventional wisdom, though, is that the gas taxes are unlikely to fly in an election year in Utah, and that state will likely take another year to look at the variety of options on the table. Wyoming, by the way, is on this list. They, as you know, just raised their gas tax 10 cents last year, but they are still short on transportation funding and could potentially explore some options in 2014. While the gas tax increase is expected to generate $72.4 million a year, only about $47 million of that is slotted to go to state highways. Much of the rest is sent to localities, and state transportation officials say they still need $64 million a year just to maintain state highways in their current condition. So now let's see what's happening in the Midwest this year, and I want to start first in Iowa, and we have on the line William Petrosky, who is a public affairs reporter for the Des Moines Register. And Bill, as I recall, last fall I was reading about Governor Branstad and his DOT director, Paul Trombino. They were tossing around a number of possible transportation funding concepts for consideration by the legislature this year. There was a memo that was leaked and sort of passed around. Have any of those concepts or any others gained any support so far among lawmakers, and has Governor Branstad gotten behind anything specific, as legislators have asked him to do?
Well, Governor Branstad hasn't gotten behind any of those, but he does say that everything in the mix. But I'll just try to make this kind of short and sweet. Basically, the session started here in mid-January, and none of these proposals was going anyplace. But we did have about 200 road lobbyists, people from business, industries, farms, state and local governments descended upon our Iowa Capitol here on Wednesday, and they had a huge lobbying day. The buttonhole legislators made a big push on this effort, and we did have a subcommittee meeting of the Iowa House hold a hearing on a 10-cent gas tax increase that would be spread over 5 years. They voted 5-0 in favor of raising the gas tax by 10 cents in Iowa, which would raise $230 million annually when fully implemented. Now, this is just passed in a subcommittee. It still needs to pass in the full transportation committee, still needs to pass in a tax committee, still needs to pass the whole House, and then it would have to go to the Iowa Senate. People here think that there's probably enough votes in the Iowa House to pass a gas tax. They think there probably aren't enough votes in the Iowa Senate to pass a gas tax. So what the situation is basically that we're going to see a lot of pressure for the rest of the session by people who are in support of raising the fuel tax to try to get something like that passed. I can tell you our own newspaper, the Des Moines Register, we have repeatedly run statewide polls on raising the gas tax. It's been overwhelmingly public opposition against it. The polls are generally nearly 2-to-1 public opposition to that. And that's why Governor Branstad was looking at this idea of alternatives, which included things like raising fees for new vehicle registrations, taxing what we call dyed fuel here in Iowa. If you put fuel in a tractor or a combine or something like that, you don't have to pay tax on it. And what they were suggesting was maybe they should start paying tax on it. Those things are just dead on arrival in general. And I think there's widespread agreement that despite all of the things happening, in terms of modern changes in transportation, that type of thing, that the gas tax is still the best way to generate new revenue. One of the big things about the gas tax is that you have people driving through the state. We're a state with, and those people are going to buy fuel, and those people are going to participate. We're right in the middle of the country here, so we have a lot of people passing through the state. Just a couple other things that I just want to mention. Iowa is a state with 3 million people, which isn't a lot of people, but we have one of the largest roadway systems in the nation. Iowa has 114,000 miles of road, which is the 14th largest road system in the country. This road system here was built at a time when the state was, this is still essentially a big farm state, but there aren't as many people living on farms, but that infrastructure is still out there. We've got about almost 90,000 miles of county roads. Many of them are gravel roads. Many of those gravel roads are getting in bad condition. Seal coats on those, in a lot of cases, they've just been plowed under because the county engineers can't maintain them. We've got 19,000 county bridges, and about one of every 5 of those are rated as deficient, and about I think it's about 4,500 of those are posted with low limits that restrict the use by heavy trucks and farm equipment. That's where the real big problem is, and that's where the most dire need is. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Well, thank you, Bill, and I hope you stick around as well, and we may have questions for you. We're going to head up to Michigan now, and that's where Gary Heinlein of the Detroit News joins us. He writes about state government and politics out of the Lansing Bureau. And Gary, last year we saw Governor Rick Snyder's proposal to raise the gas tax and vehicle registration fees failed to gain much traction in the legislature. So what ideas, if any, are on the table this year?
Well, this is probably the best answer is it's a not this year. The two dominant transportation issues in Michigan over the last 5 years have been the need or desire to build another bridge another international bridge between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, and the need to pretty much double the amount the state spends per year on road repairs. The bridge proposal, both proposals came up during the administration of Jennifer Granholm, the previous governor. Neither of them got any traction in the legislature. The bridge proposal was taken up by Governor Snyder Rick Snyder when he became governor in 2010. It also, despite being a Republican governor with Republican majorities in both chambers of the legislature, he was able to get no traction with that proposal and is now pursuing it independently of the legislature through a 3-way agreement between the state, the federal government, and the government of Canada. Under the plan, Canada would pay all but a small part of the $1.1 to $2 billion cost. The federal government would pick up the rest. Canada would get its money back from bridge tolls. That plan is quietly moving forward now. It's strongly opposed by the owner of the existing bridge, which is 85 years old and not in an ideal location to support the increased border traffic. But it looks like, and he's pursuing that through lobbying in the federal in Congress and also in the courts. But it looks like the plan is going to go forward, and the bridge is on track to be completed in 2020. The need for more road revenue came up during the Granholm administration. She set up a task force in 2008 found the state needs to be spending another $1.4 billion on road repairs each year. That is about double what is now being spent. That got nowhere during her governorship. In 2011, the Republican legislature paid for its own study. That study found that the state not only should be spending $1.4 billion more per year now, but by before the middle of the next decade should be spending $2.5 billion more. Snyder endorsed that idea. Yeah, he made it a strong part of his a strong priority last year, starting with his State of the State message in January and a speaking tour in which he promoted the idea or the proposal. Snyder's proposal would have the plan that he's kind of tossed out would have increased vehicle registration fees by about $10 a month or $120 per year. For a lot of drivers, that would be just about double what they're paying now. And the second part of the plan would have replaced the state's flat fuel taxes of 19 cents on gasoline and 15 cents on diesel with a proportional tax, or more or less of a sales tax. The idea behind that plan was that it could could make road revenue somewhat inflation-proof by rising with the increase in pump prices. But Snyder also would have set the initial rate high enough to bring in a lot more money immediately. The legislature spent most of last year trying to find its own way of raising the money. The plan that became most prominent was based on sales tax increase, and it was two-pronged. Unlike most states, Michigan applies its 6% sales tax to fuel on top of the flat fuel taxes. The proposal put together in the Senate would have that 6% fuel tax collected on gasoline, like the 6% fuel tax, or it's like the 6% sales tax collected throughout the state, goes to education and purposes other than roads. The Senate plan would have taken the portion of it that applies to roads and used that revenue for roads, and then increased the general sales tax by a penny or more and dedicated the money to schools or education and the other purposes that sales taxes now go for. That would have required a statewide vote because the sales tax is in the state constitution, and to change it requires a constitutional amendment. That plan was discussed off and on all through the year, but never the Republican leaders who were discussing it never got enough buy-in to bring it to a vote. So we enter 2014 with no change, and the prospects this year are pretty dim for any kind of a major increase in road funding because it's an election year. The governor's up for re-election. The legislative incumbents are up for re-election, and they've already signaled that they're not going to embark on a major tax increase. There is a prospect of some additional funding because the state's projecting that it will have a surplus of around $971 million going into the 2015 fiscal year that starts October 1st. but if there's any increase at all, it's probably going to be on the order of 15 to 20% of what's needed. And so that's where we stand at this point. There is some hope that the proponents of more road money hold out some hope that following the November election, they might be able to, the legislature might be willing to pass a major increase during the two-week lame duck session in early December, but the chances of that seem pretty slim, and that's where we stand.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that report from Michigan. And folks, remember, if you have a question or comment for one of our speakers today, you can enter it in the GoToWebinar interface itself, and we will collate all of those comments and questions and ask them for the various folks at the end of the webinar. So Wisconsin is another state back in the transportation funding conversation for 2014. And Mary Spikuza is joining us from the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. She is a political reporter there. And Mary, I read last year that Governor Scott Walker wanted a sustainable transportation funding alternative to the gas tax to factor into the next state budget, and that he tasked Transportation Secretary Mark Gottlieb with trying to come up with a breakthrough solution. Has any such solution materialized there this year?
Well, not yet. There was a committee that came together and kind of came up with a list of recommendations. It's like the Governor's Transportation Finance and Policy Commission. They came up with a bunch of suggestions, but those were not very popular with Governor Walker or with Secretary Gottlieb. They included a gas tax increase, increasing fees for registration and driver's licenses, things like that, things that Governor Walker, who is not a big fan of raising taxes and wants to lower taxes, really supported, so they did not go very far with those suggestions. He asked Gottlieb to come up with a list of alternatives, and said that, maybe something that could really be a national leader in terms of coming up with a plan for transportation funding. We have not seen we've not seen a concrete proposal so far. Governor Walker just did his State of the State address recently, and in it he talked far more about tax cuts and property tax cuts, income tax cuts. It is an election year for him, so I don't think he's going to suddenly back gas tax increases, especially not now, if ever. So we're kind of waiting to see what becomes of transportation funding, but the state does, heading into the next budget cycle, something's going to need to be done, because in the past the segregated transportation fund has been raided. Republicans have been very critical of those raids, and they are in control of the governor's office as well as the Senate and the Assembly, but we haven't seen general agreement on what to do to fund transportation. And even among Republicans, there's been some disagreement. Speaker Bach, who leads the Assembly, has been far more in favor of, lobbying for toll roads, or saying that maybe we should explore toll roads, but that would need a change in federal law, so the governor's office really hasn't been seriously promoting that, saying, that's not something that we could do if we wanted to right now. So we're really waiting to see what's going to come of transportation funding talk here.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Mary, for that report from Wisconsin, and please stay with us. A couple of other states I want to mention to keep an eye on in the Midwest this year. One is Indiana, where legislation was considered last year to allow the Indianapolis area to raise its own regional taxes to pay for transit. Lawmakers ended up commissioning a study instead. This year, a bill is moving forward once again, and it cleared a state Senate committee this week. The bill would allow 5 counties to raise income and business taxes to pay for public transportation. It would require the voters in those counties to approve the plans, and would require that fares cover 25% of the system's operating costs. There was a controversial amendment added at the last minute that bans light rail and prevents state funds from being used for any expansion. It also authorizes the Indiana Finance Authority to issue bonds on behalf of counties and strips organized labor of the ability to engage in binding arbitration. So that amendment passed over the objections of Democrats who were initially inclined to support the overall bill. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. Minnesota is the other one from the Midwest that's been in the conversation for quite some time. And the Minnesota DOT said recently that despite plans to spend $18 billion over the next 20 years on transportation projects, $30 billion is actually required to meet the expected needs on the state's roads and bridges. The state ranks 38th nationally in the condition of its interstate highway pavement. Transportation Commissioner Charlie Zelle has been traveling the state in recent months to make the case for increased investment. Lawmakers are looking at new ways to generate additional revenues for transportation as well. Among the ideas on the table is indexing the gas tax to the overall fuel purchase. Governor Mark Dayton has also introduced a $986 million bonding proposal that includes statewide infrastructure projects, including $30 million for bridge repair and $10 million for local road improvements. Dayton declined to support a gas tax increase last year, saying that while such a move could buy the state a few more years, it's not a comprehensive solution that will help close the 20-year gap and help the state make a long-term strategic investment in transportation. So now let's head to the eastern states, and specifically to New Hampshire. And Brian Walston is a digital journalist for New Hampshire Public Radio. He joins us now. Brian, you wrote a piece recently about how lawmakers in Concord appear likely to take another shot at raising the gas tax this year after a bill failed to get across the finish line in 2013. So what's on the table in New Hampshire this year?
Well, last year there was a bill that would have raised it 12 cents, and it would have done just about everything that needs to be done. It would have raised about $800 million. It would have funded the long term, as we got a 10-year transportation plan here. It would have funded that. It would have given the municipalities enough money to fix their roads and bridges. It would have funded operations in the State Department of Transportation, and it failed. The only other measure last year that would have addressed transportation was a bill to license a casino, and the Senate wanted the casino, and the House killed it. And a couple days later, the House the Senate went and killed the House's bill on the gas tax. Unfortunately, we've got the same scenario. It looks like it's going to play out again this year. The difference is that a Republican in the Senate has proposed a bill to index the gas tax, which hasn't been raised here since 1992, to the consumer price index. Unfortunately, the Senate president has said, well, I'll let you bring it to the floor, but I'm going to fight it. So the Senate here has a small Republican majority, so that bill doesn't look all that great, and right now wouldn't raise nearly enough money to do what needs to be done. Again, there are casino bills on the table. The governor here, it's an election year, so she's been sort of arm's length for any of this. She does support a casino. She has not made a big play for transportation funding. She supports a casino here. One bill would, I guess, commit about $50 million, $45 to $50 million a year of the revenues from table games and slot machines would be dedicated to transportation projects. So these bills are just now starting to get debated. The gas tax is likely to come later after everyone sees what happens with the casino bills. They've tried a few things here in the past to sort of plug small holes. A couple of years ago, there was a commission that looked at so-called sustainable funding mechanisms, vehicle miles taxed, tolls, private-public partnerships, things like that, in the end were rejected, and the head of that commission basically told me that they thought the gas tax was the fairest, and it was a mechanism that was in place to collect the tax, but as it is everywhere, it's just not meeting the need. So that's where we stand. I mean, things are just kind of getting rolling here. The casino bill was debated this week. It'll be back again, and then there'll be some. The House has a casino bill as well. So it seems to me that's where the revenue. Everybody's sort of hanging their hat on trying to license a casino here, and it's been that way for years.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brian, for that update on what's happening in New Hampshire. A couple of other states from the east worth mentioning here. Actually, those are some points there that Brian had mentioned, but a couple of other states from the east worth mentioning. Delaware, and this is pretty much brand new as of Wednesday, and Dan Bach mentioned this earlier. So this is breaking news, if you will. Thanks to Dan for bringing it to my attention. Governor Markell is proposing an increase in the state motor fuels tax as part of his plan to create a reliable revenue stream for the state's Transportation Trust Fund and provide a significant spending boost for transportation projects statewide. The gas tax in Delaware has not been increased since 1995. The governor's proposal comes in response to recommendations made by a Transportation Trust Fund task force. And the governor and his transportation secretary have both warned that voting against new funding would result in delays to some critical roadway projects. So Delaware may be another state to keep an eye on this year. Also, Rhode Island, a special legislative commission has been tasked with seeking ways to pay for maintenance of the bridges over Narragansett Bay. They did not offer a consensus recommendation in their final report that was released this month, but commission members are expressing confidence that they can craft legislation create a dedicated funding stream for both bridge upkeep and road maintenance throughout the state. They are promising it won't include bridge tolls, however. Governor Lincoln Chafee has said he wants to redirect $80 million from the gas tax over 5 years to pay for the bridge upkeep, but the commission contends the state's transportation needs are much larger. Some lawmakers have expressed support for such things as setting aside more from the state's general revenues, increasing the gas tax, creating an infrastructure trust fund, and issuing bonds. Well, finally, let's take a look at some states in the South that are looking at transportation funding, and Mississippi is one such state. Been debating options in recent months. They had a task force headed up by Senate Transportation Committee Chairman Willie Simmons that concluded the state doesn't have enough money to meet its highway needs, but they were unable to come to consensus on a funding solution. And in addition, there was a report that came out this month that calls for the State Department of Transportation to be more accountable for the money it spends. Jeff Ami from the Associated Press in Jackson has written recently about that, as well as some potential funding options that could be on the table legislatively. Jeff, what's the status of those options, and what are their chances politically this year?
Well, those options are near death, shall we say. Both the governor and the lieutenant governor have come out here against raising gas taxes. This is not an election year in Mississippi. Next year is our election. And once you take the gas tax off the table, the options become limited. The heads of the Transportation Committee in the House and the Senate are both Democrats, although our legislature is majority Republican in both houses. They claim they are looking around for other sources of money. One idea is we'll just borrow some money. The one other idea is that we will somehow recoup some money that was, quote, borrowed from previous gas tax revenue. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of support for those ideas, or really remarkably to do anything. There's very little disagreement in Mississippi that we don't have enough money to maintain the system we built. If you set your Wayback Machine to 1987, we increased our gas tax and did raised a whole bunch of other revenue, and we built more than 1,000 miles of 4-lane highway. And Mississippians generally are almost universally agree that that was one of the best things that the state had done in the last generation. But now that a lot of that infrastructure is aging out, and it's really time to go overlay a whole lot of asphalt. And so the prospects for anything happening this year have gotten remarkably dim. And although the gas tax in 1987 was passed in an election year, I would say that the prospects for next year, which will be our pre-election session, are also not very hot. I think you're probably looking at 2016 before you get down to a serious discussion. The real problem here is that the business community has not gotten behind this effort. The business community got strongly behind the effort in 1987, and the road builders have been out trying to rally support in the business community and claim they have some, but won't put their cards on the table. Won't tell us who. They claim they've got some big supporters that they're going to unveil any day now, but that any day seems to have come and gone 2 or 3 times now. And so what's going on is that a lot of trade, one particularly powerful trade association, the Mississippi Manufacturers Association, which is very oriented toward low taxes, has been basically calling, the transportation department the most worthless, corrupt, inefficient organization they've ever met. This recent legislative report largely debunks most of that, but there is not a consensus, and without a consensus in the business community, the chances that a whole bunch of Republicans are going to vote to raise gas taxes significantly is next to nil.
Well, Jeff, thank you for your reporting as well for Mississippi. We have one more reporter joining us this afternoon, and that is Dave Boucher from the Charleston Daily Mail in Charleston, West Virginia. And Dave, just like in Mississippi, there was a commission in West Virginia that met last year and considered recommendations for increasing transportation revenues. Have those recommendations translated into legislative proposals, or are there other options on the table being discussed there this year?
No, they haven't turned into any sort of proposed legislation at this point, at least issued by the governor. The governor hasn't even issued an official response yet to the Blue Ribbon Commission's proposals. Those proposals circle mostly around $1 billion in potential bonding that the state could receive for more transportation funding. Right now, when you talk about transportation funding in West Virginia, you typically talk about the Turnpike Authority and tolls that are in the state. There's a turnpike that runs from Charleston, the capital, to the southern part of the state, and the authority reaps a lot of money off of that, but it's also paying down debt service that's supposed to be paid off in 2019, I think, if I remember correctly. And so there's a debate as to whether you keep the tolls on the turnpike after that to gain more revenue, or if you don't. And now, after this report, it doesn't look like there's going to be any sort of movement on taking off those tolls. Whether or not the governor signs off on massive new bond issues is another story. Right now, everybody in West Virginia is focused on poisoned water. So the likelihood of any sort of legislation from the governor concerning transportation is slim to none.
Understandable. Well, thank you, Dave, and we appreciate your reporting as well. For those listening in around the country this afternoon, we're going to get to questions for all of our reporters here in just a moment. So please be thinking about what you want to ask and enter your questions or comments into the GoToWebinar interface on your screen. I did want to mention 2 other states in the South that are in the transportation funding conversation, and they are both states with unfinished business from 2013, shall we say. In Missouri, State Representative Dave Hinson has a bill that would ask voters to temporarily increase the state's sales and use tax by 1 cent to fund transportation projects. A similar proposal stalled in the legislature last year. There's also an initiative petition being supported by a group called Missourians for Safe Transportation that would do much the same thing, but that measure has run into some opposition, and the proposed ballot language is actually being challenged in court. The other state is Texas. That's where voters will have the chance to decide in November on a ballot measure to cut in half the 75% of the severance tax on natural gas production. Those revenues currently go into the state's rainy day fund. If the measure is approved, 37.5% of the tax would go to fund roads, and that could generate about $1 billion annually. Unfortunately, that's just 1/4 of the amount the Texas Department of Transportation has said is actually needed to maintain existing roadways and current congestion levels. So we'll have to see if those somewhat more limited solutions fly in either state and where those states go from here. Dan Bach, I want to come back to you for a moment before we get to questions. Based on what, go ahead, go to the next slide. Based on what you've heard from these reporters around the country, what stands out and has your overall assessment of what we're likely to see this year changed at all from what you've heard?
No, I guess there's not a ton of surprises. I'm always just kind of, waiting for what, a crisis or something may come up in given states. But it is, I think the one that we didn't talk about is a very tiny, well, in comparison to some of these, Oregon led. In addition to what's going on in Washington, Oregon's legislature is also getting mad at the Washington legislature for not approving money for a bridge that would go from Portland to Vancouver, Washington. But that's just an aside. I think more than anything, the political considerations, the fact that it's an election year, the fact that, gas taxes are really unpopular, and it is kind of interesting when you look at the proposals. They generally, for like a 10-cent per gallon gas tax increase, you're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 a year for an average motorist, which people wouldn't necessarily notice, but the headlines are enough. And so I think that scares off a lot of people, especially in an election year. It's always a tough sell. And again, if you don't have the governor, and usually, I forget who mentioned it, the business community has to be behind. There's got to be sort of momentum coming behind it before these things usually take form. I would just say that almost nothing passes the first time. There's usually a whole bunch of studies and lobbying days and just proposals floated and negotiations done before these things finally make it into law. So if that's just a little bit of a nugget to keep in mind, even though it doesn't look like a lot's going on this year, some of that spade work may pay off in years to come.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dan, and we're going to, we want to get in a couple of questions and comments here if we can. Again, if you have something to tell us, please enter it in the GoToWebinar interface, and we will try to direct it to the best person. We've got a couple of questions here so far. First of all, this person asks, let's see, do you expect to see an increase in states who look at alternatives to the gas tax, like VMT taxes? So there's actually a couple of questions about that. Oregon last year passed a program that's going to kick in next year, where they're going to do it's even broader than a pilot project. It's actually a permanent scalable project where they're actually going to test a mileage-based user fee. And so, Dan, what do you think? Are we going to see more states try to follow that Oregon model?
I think that there's definitely interest out there, and I actually think Jordan's written about some interest in Washington about that. As you know, when Oregon did that, the pilot program a couple years ago, they partnered with Washington, and I believe it was Nevada. So I think it's out there. But even in Oregon, it's a limited project. So it's something that people are definitely interested in, but it's not something you can turn the key on and have it roll out right away. And in addition to Washington, I believe there's some interest in Indiana for that concept. But again, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce is the one bringing it up. But again, I think it's one of those that people are going to watch what Oregon does. They may roll out their own programs like Washington, but it's something that's several years down the road.
Jordan, what do you think about what's? I know that Washington has been working pretty closely with Oregon over the last few years on this.
That's right, and they're now kind of doing their own process of trying to figure out what it would look like in Washington, and to some extent it might be reinventing the wheel because Oregon's already kind of plotted this out, but they kind of insist here that if they do anything in Washington, it'll need to be sold to Washington residents and studied with all the, for all the unique characteristics of our state. So they're in the very, still pretty early stages of actually moving to something, even though they're in the final stages of study. They've been studying for several years, but they're way behind Oregon, which has already got a plan that's been approved by the legislature, albeit a voluntary one for just a few drivers. Here, it won't even probably land in the legislature's lap until at least 2015, and probably more like 2016. And then if they agree, and there does appear to be some consensus, even a bipartisan consensus, that they need to do something on this, that there might be a pilot project in 2016. That would probably be the soonest anything could happen. It would be, I would guess, years later before anything happened statewide.
Yeah. Another question here, and this one may be for Dan Bach as well. Are there any states considering legislation related to electric vehicles? And I know we just saw the Virginia legislature try to strike down what they passed last year with regards to at least hybrid vehicles. I guess the electric vehicle provision is kept in place. Is that right?
And I have to go back and revisit that. I know I have seen a number of states interested in taxing high mileage, and so Virginia is the opposite, right? So they originally gave them the additional fee, and now are considering repealing that. It's one of the more unpopular things in the transportation package. But I think it is interesting. You'll have to look at the benefits for electric and hybrid vehicles. Especially in places where there's, hot or HOV lanes, whether or not the hybrids and or electric vehicles are allowed to go in those without charges. So I think there's an increasing awareness that they're more popular, that giving them kind of the incentive may not be necessary as much anymore as people look at, increased fuel efficiency as incentive enough, and car makers are making more of them. So it's one of those things. I think you'll see legislators take a second look at, especially the ones that have been giving benefits to them, whether or not those benefits need to go forward. And then, as you mentioned, with gas taxes, if they're not consuming any, what sort of taxes they can use, because as a reminder, we have a hybrid, and it's quite a bit heavier than a regular car, so it probably also eats up the roads a little bit more than your regular car.
Yeah. One other question here we have, of the states considering raising motor fuels taxes, are there proposals to raise the tax on diesel above that on gasoline? And I'm not sure the answer to that. I think I've seen that some are looking to increase diesel taxes more. Do you know anything on that, Dan?
I'm not entirely sure. As you mentioned, the Delaware one just came out a couple days ago, and like I said, there's only a few places where it's really in serious contention. I'm not sure what the state is on Washington, but that's another good place to look, and also maybe Iowa. But generally, it's not uncommon for those to go up simultaneously. But of course, the voters tend to be more keyed in on the gasoline tax.
Great. Okay. Well, we are past our time this afternoon, and we want to thank everybody for being on with us this afternoon, and thanks for the questions. So we're going to wrap up. Here are some ways that you can get hold of me and find out what we're doing at CSG on the transportation policy front. I can also put you in touch with any of the folks you heard from today, and hopefully you saw their Twitter handles on their bio pages as well. You can get hold of them that way. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Look for this webinar to be archived soon on the CSG Knowledge Center, probably about midweek next week. In case any of you missed any of it or want to pass it along to a friend. I'll also have a full write-up on the webinar in the next issue of the Capital Ideas e-newsletter, which comes out in about 2 weeks, so look for that as well. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend.